We're going to start back up in another couple of minutes, so just get yourself comfortable. Give you an outline of how this afternoon is going to go. So I'm going to talk for about half an hour more, and we're starting a little bit late from lunch, but I think that's because the food was delicious and the conversation was delightful. So, you know, that's a good reason to start back up a few minutes late this afternoon. I'm going to talk. We're going to have some more opportunity for small group. I'd like to have an opportunity for us to reconvene, to bring forward any wrapping up comments that came from your small groups, to ask me any questions, and we're hoping to be done around 2:30. Sound like a plan? All right. We still waiting for anybody, or are we all set? Oh, I can see a few people coming in, so we'll just give a moment for everybody to get seated. Now, this morning I talked about those three components to ultra-realism being seeing, accepting, and embracing. So our final session this afternoon is really going to be focusing on that third part, the embracing who we really are as the church. And I started with a metaphor this morning around long-distance running. So I'm going to end with the same metaphor in our conversation this afternoon. I'm going to read to you an excerpt from my book, Why Gather, and it's toward the end of the book. It's, I think, an illustration that gives us an image for the why of who we are as the life of the church and the gathered community. And this is from the chapter called Embrace the Story We Share. And it's from the section of that chapter called Ad Hoc Water Stations and a Homemade Finish Line. My road back from burnout recovery included a homemade finish line at the end of a virtual marathon. In the new year of 2021, I began training for a marathon. Although I had been running for about 15 years, I had never even once considered making a marathon a goal. I had actively ruled out ever doing so. Whenever I came to the finish line of a half marathon, I knew without a doubt that I would never, ever be able or want to run another 21.1 kilometers on top of what I had already run to complete a half. That was a feat too extraordinary to contemplate. But 2021 dawned with the second wave of COVID. Do you guys remember the second wave of COVID? I think we had about 25 waves after that. The second wave of COVID wreaking havoc on all of our lives. The first half of 2021 was mostly spent under stay-at-home orders in the province of Ontario. We were allowed to go out for exercise, though. Running has, throughout my time as a priest, been a mainstay of my spiritual well-being, not to mention my physical and emotional well-being too. It's where I feed my inner introvert. It's how I step back from situations in order to reflect rather than just react. It's my stockpile of endorphins that provide a mood passport through situations that would otherwise emotionally sink me. So I made a plan to run. Although I run alone, and although I love running alone, I don't ever really run by myself. Julie, Janice, Janine, Diane, Kent, and Jeff are my go-to running friends who helped me with training, stretching, and nutrition plans for the months ahead. They checked in with me throughout to encourage and motivate and advise. My non-running friends did too. My marathon goal became a goal that my circle of friends and family invested in with me. I signed up for the virtual Saskatchewan Marathon. In 2020 and 2021, most races that were held were virtual ones, which meant you ran your race where you were using a running watch or an app to track your time and distance, and then you post your results online afterwards. This virtual race allowed me to join a race taking place in Saskatoon from my neck of the woods in Niagara, 3,000 kilometers away. At the end of May, my race bib, t-shirt, and finisher's medal arrived in the mail. June 19th was race day. To say that training was intense is an obvious statement. About 2/3 of the way through, when all I seemed to be doing was running and recovering from running, it felt impossible. On Jeff's advice, I planned out 5 30-plus kilometer runs over the course of training in order to prepare for the final distance. On my 34-kilometer distance run, my mind went to some dark and fretful places. I clocked the 17-kilometer mark and, realizing I was only halfway through, nearly gave up. When I finally stumbled home at the end, I agonized about how I could possibly add on another 8 kilometers beyond that to attain the required distance on race day. It was around this time that a number of people started reaching out to me to ask if they could help on the day of the marathon. Julie and Janine and Britt offered to run part of the way with me. Tom and his daughter, my goddaughter Ivy, wanted to have music playing at the finish line. John and Anne and Beth realized that I would need water stations along the way, and Anne took it upon herself to organize and staff these for me. Paul and Sue were at every water station from 5:30 a.m. onward, and in between water stations they circled by my route in order to cheer me on along the way. June 19th was a hot, humid day. All week the forecast had promised rain, and instead the sun came out after an overnight thunderstorm, creating circumstances that felt a lot like a steam bath. I had planned my sports drink and my fueling needs very carefully based on my training, but my plan fell short for the actual conditions of the day. When I got to the last water station, with 7 kilometers left to go, I realized that I didn't have enough fluid to address my wild, sweaty thirst. Paul grabbed an extra water bottle from his car and gave me that to top myself up. Brian had come to the last station on his bike, feeling that it might be a good idea if he cycled behind me for the last leg. When he had suggested it the day before, it sounded unnecessary to me, but like I have said before in this book, Brian's ideas are usually good ones, so I said yes. Again, I ran out of water on that last stretch, and this time it was Brian to save the day, refilling my water bottle from his own. He also passed over to me a few energy chews, which gave me the added boost I needed to keep going and to knock out the last few kilometers. When I was rounding the corner into my neighborhood and the promised finish line, Brian cycled ahead to tell everyone I was on my way. About 20 masked friends and family cheered me across a ribbon finish line held by my mom and my kids. Ivy had "The Girl Is on Fire" pumping over a little karaoke machine. John placed a laurel wreath on my head. Gordon went to fetch me a big icy cold glass of restorative chocolate milk. I know how privileged I am to have people show up for me like that. I know the blessing of being able-bodied and training for a marathon as a way of attending to my emotional and spiritual health. These are specific and incredible blessings. That marathon finish line is exactly an image of the church, who we are, why we continue to show up for one another, what it's all about. We are people who don't run alone and who actually can't run alone. We are people who can fill in the gaps for one another and who must fill in the gaps for one another. We are people who are charged with figuring out a makeshift finish line and homemade water stations when all of the rest of the world has been overturned. We are people whose small bits of belief, insight, dedication, and training don't add up to a whole lot on our own, but together we can get somewhere. That somewhere attests to a truth and a power that is greater than us. greater than the sum of our parts, that embodies life and death and resurrection and hope and healing and need and the beauty of the finish line and all of the water stations along the way. That's an image for the church, and at the heart of that image, I think that there is an answer to the why it matters that we do this, why it matters that we show up, why it matters that we gather. I do want to talk in my last session this afternoon about the two main ways that I think that the community of faith and the body of the church has of living into the why. We can be the church who is gathered, and we can be the church who is sent. And I believe both have an important place in our future, and both are an important offering for the life of the world. In our Anglican church, we talk about parishes. And the parish really embodies what it is to be the gathered church. Now, I was having a conversation with my friend Ed, who is on my breakfast team at the church. And he's part of another denomination, a very faithful Christian denomination. He helps out with our breakfast program at St. George's. But he was reflecting to me on a difference that he saw, a profound difference that he saw between his denomination and our Anglican denomination. He said, our church has just moved out to the country, where all of the new suburbs are being built and where there are, the people with money and time and a willingness to be part of kind of this big mega church. That's where his church had sold their property in downtown St. Catharines and had moved out where the building was happening. He said, but your church is staying here, right here in downtown St. Catharines. Downtown St. Catharines has been through a lot, and downtown St. Catharines isn't the nicest part of the city. Downtown St. Catharines has a lot of hunger, a lot of people who are unhoused, a lot of very visible addiction, a lot of very visible mental health struggles. But he said, your church stays here where it's been planted and where it's called to serve. And that's why he wanted to be part of the breakfast program at my church, despite belonging to another church, because he thought that there was something profound and very faithful about that parish life of service. This is where we have been planted, and this is the community and the people that we serve. There is a rootedness in our parish tradition that makes it clear where and how we're called to serve. It allows us, I think, in the life of the parish, not to see ourselves as people who have chosen to be part of a community, but who are chosen to be part of a community. We get to be the people who are chosen to serve and to pray and to be faithful right here where we are. There's another component around the parish church and the gathered church, and that has to do with sacred space. And I think that we're really lucky and blessed to be able to have our conversation today in this particular sacred space. I think that there is something really important about the witness of prayer when we intentionally keep gathering in one sacred space as a place where prayer is going to happen repeatedly. I don't know whether you can feel it. I can certainly feel it in this space. I can feel it in St. George's where I lead. I could feel it in St. Peter's when I was in there the other day. the space where we repeatedly gather and pray and worship, it gets soaked through with that prayer in a way that is difficult to explain, but I think pretty hard to deny. You can feel the generations of prayer in this space. Over the course of the pandemic, our church, St. George's, worked with a guy called Jeremy. And Jeremy was a member of our congregation. He ran a tech company, and he really, really helped us in terms of negotiating our live stream equipment and our sound system equipment and how we were going to connect with people online and why. He gave a lot of thought to the camera angles and the video equipment and the lighting. And he did that because he could completely see and invest in the value of our sacred space. He really, really wanted our online worship to unlock that sacred space for people, even when they couldn't physically be there with us. He talked a lot with us about the incalculable riches we could offer in our space, not just by being in person, but also by being online. And ironically, it was in the emptiness of that sacred space that I think a lot of us came to consider in new ways the value of that sacred space. Here's another piece around, oops, that's not where I want it to go. Sorry, I must be missing a slide there. Anyway, this is another piece around the parish church that I don't hear discussed a lot and that I think is really vitally important. So in our diocese, we talk a lot about missional church, and we've also talked about fresh expressions of church. We talk at various times about church plants. I don't know how alive those conversations are in other parts of the Anglican Church of Canada, but I imagine that there have been various initiatives all across Canada around, new worshiping communities and new expressions of churches. I've had the opportunity in the churches where I have served to be part of starting a couple of those new worshiping communities. I talked about one earlier today, Advent Cafe. When I was at my church in Aurelia, we started a Saturday night worshiping community. And, in every case, those worshiping communities had their distinct kind of character and flavor that was different from what would happen in the church on Sunday mornings. But in all cases, those creative new expressions of church were very much sponsored by the existing parish congregation. There were people within that parish, that existing parish, who prayed with me, who discerned with me, who planned with me, and who committed to being part of those new worshiping communities so that when somebody came through the doors to try this new thing, there was a gathered community already there. They supported those new community initiatives with time, with talent, with treasure. There are examples, I know, in the Anglican Church of Canada of, kind of that more traditional idea that we think of a church plant where, somebody goes into a community, starts a church in a basement somewhere, then builds a building, and they have a self-sustaining new community of faith, within, say, 5 or 10 years. Those examples are really few and far between. And in our Anglican Church, most, if not all, of our new expressions of church flow out of the generosity and the creativity of the gathered parish church. And again, I think that that's something that we need to be really clear about naming as part of the gift and charism of what it means to be the gathered community. that we have the opportunity in our gathering, in our prayer, in our discernment, in our generosity, to seed new possibilities of how we become church. Now, I said that there are, kind of two expressions of how we live into the why this matters, and how we respond to the brokenness of the world around us. And that's just a very initial dive into some of the powerful offerings of what it is to be the church gathered. But also, we need to be very clear that the church is also sent. We're gathered, and then we're sent. And I want to just share two quick stories with you about the church that has been sent. The first story is my friend Anita, who is just a remarkable woman of faith and has such a heart for service. And she's somebody who has kind of lived on the margins of society at different times in her life, and has just completely dedicated her life of ministry to serving with the marginalized. When the pandemic first happened and we went into that first lockdown, we were gathering our teams together for the live stream worship that we were going to do. And I reached out to Anita as somebody that I had hoped would be part of one of those live stream teams. And she said, no, I'm not gonna be part of a live stream team. I'm gonna be out in the parking lot of the church. I'm gonna be in the breakfast program of the church. I'm going to be with the people who can no longer gather in our church, who are now waiting at a takeout window to get their meals. That's where I need to be. That's where God is calling me right now, here in this time, in this space. And I think often of that witness and how powerful that was for her to just so clearly say to me, like, not that we shouldn't be doing the live stream, but that's not where I'm going to serve. I'm going to serve in the parking lot. The other quick story that I want to share with you comes back to my son Gordon and that conversation that we had around new initiatives that we were going to try at St. George's. And on his advice and encouragement, our church is going to try TikTok. Definitely like way outside of my comfort zone, our comfort zone. We have a director of music who is very cool at our church. The rest of us are very clear that we're not cool. We're definitely not cool enough for TikTok. We know this about ourselves. We're not just trying to jump on the bandwagon of like the coolest, hippest thing, but we're gonna try this. And the reason why we're gonna try this is because of what Gordon said to me that evening. Because there's a whole generation of people who just don't have any sort of positive association with the life of the church and the invitation to be part of God's love. And so we're working with the youth of our church to figure out how we can speak meaningfully into their culture using their language, reminding them and reminding us that, again, God's fingerprints are smudged all across our world if we're just attentive to the presence and power of God. God loves us, and we're not alone. And I said over lunch, and I think I said yesterday over lunch too, so much of ministry these days is about throwing noodles on the wall and seeing what sticks. One of the biggest I think characteristics that we can embrace in the life of the church right now is just a willingness to try things. Try, and maybe it won't work, and maybe it will. Maybe we'll touch somebody's life, maybe we won't. For us, we're pretty clear that Again, we don't think that TikTok is going to make us cool. We don't think TikTok is going to fill our pews with young people. But we take really seriously that responsibility to be people who embrace and share the message of God's love and our true identity as people who are created for relationship. So, TikTok it is. The reason why I share these two stories of Anita and of TikTok is because I think that we have to reorient a lot of our goals and a lot of our metrics around what success looks like as we venture into being the church that is sent into the world. Again, I don't think that all of our initiatives of being the church in the world are going to save the institutional church and fill our churches with young people. But they might be faithful actions of service nonetheless. Now, as I close out my talk this afternoon, and again turn it over to you for some conversation, I just want to shift in this very, very last part from the why to the how. And I know that's not why you invited me out here for today's conversation. My job isn't to talk to you about the how. But I want to give you a little bit of food for thought in terms of considering that next step and the how of how we live into the why. How we live into the why. And again, I want to share this because I think it's a part of our conversation that has been largely missing. Across Canada, with few exceptions, I would say that our church communities are under-resourced. I think that many of our clergy teams and many of the people in our congregation feel more and more stretched to do more and more with less and less. And the thing is that under-resourcing is a reality that we all have a share in responding to. I think that we do need to ask questions about the institutional weight of our church, about how we can better locate resources in local communities, which is where community engagement and prayerful discernment gets lived out. I think that if we are putting more resources into our local communities, then we also need to be asking serious questions about what needs to be centralized and why. And is there maybe even greater centralization that can happen around certain pieces of our institutional life so that we can better equip communities on the ground? Are there ways that we can pool our resources on the ground in order to create ministry teams and parish communities that can feel like they're flourishing rather than barely scraping by? Here's the thing that I don't hear discussed a lot. The truth is that we have a lot of money. Now, we probably don't have a lot of money in our bank accounts in our individual parishes, but if you look at the Anglican Church of Canada's real estate holdings across Canada, not to mention endowment funds that exist in, some of our bank accounts, there is a legacy of wealth in our church. Past generations bought land, built buildings, and left money to the church. And that generosity does need to be stewarded very thoughtfully, responsibly, and prayerfully. I have kind of a mantra that I go with in household budgeting, which is we can do anything, but we can't do everything. I think it's like that in the church as well. We can do anything in the church with the resources that we have, but we can't do everything. So what do we want to do? And why do we want to do it? And then what do we need to let go of in order to do it? What are the central offerings of the Anglican Church, of the parish church, of the gathered church? Why do those offerings matter? Why do those offerings matter for the life of the world? And then how are we going to equip and support those offerings so that we can do more than survive? With that note, I'm going to turn things over to you. Again, I know that that is just a very initial foray into the how rather than just the why. I'm going to turn things over to you. It is 1:38, and if you still have your small group conversations from the morning, now would be the time to look at part 2. There are more handouts up here in case you left yours at the lunch table. We'll reconvene at 2 o'clock so that we can hear from you a little bit more, and you can ask any final wrap-up questions. So back to your small groups. We'll reconvene at 2. Amanda, are you still running the live stream? Okay. So I would suggest that if you have a question or comment, you should maybe come up to the microphone so that people on the live stream will still be able to hear what is being said. If you have kind of an insight from your small group conversations, if you have a question, I'll invite you to come up. Don't all rush up at once.
Who's going to be the brave person?
Yeah.
We just need one person to get it going.
Something that you take away from your small group conversations, something that came up that you want to continue to talk about, something that you want to ask about. Lisa's going to be brave. Okay.
So Martha, we were talking about how you were talking about the parish and the church gathered, but also the church scattered, that church being sent in the community. And one of the things that I often think about is how do we create environments, whether that's inherited traditional church Sunday morning environment. We think about that in terms of how we plan our liturgy. How do we create an environment where people connect with the holy, connect with one another, Christ in the community? But there are also folks who will never come on a Sunday morning or never walk through those doors for all kinds of reasons. Sometimes it's too painful, and sometimes it's just too foreign. It's not of their culture, and they're just really unfamiliar with this. It's not a comforting place. So in terms of thinking about other environments where we can gather, or as we're being scattered, what would you say would be some of the characteristics or some of the descriptives for how we might create environments, particularly outside the church? Because I think we know kind of how to do that internally, especially in terms of kind of formal worship. And it could be formal outside, but are there some things that we should think about that would help us create environments where folks can explore faith in the Anglican tradition or spirituality in the Anglican tradition and encounter this connectedness that we have with one another but with all holy God?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of ways of answering that question, and I think that to some degree it's happening, again, like ultra real. I think some of this is happening in the small group that I was part of. I think Bishop Sandra, you kind of named that. Just if you look at people who have been formed in the life of the church and don't participate in the life of the church now, it's interesting how you can kind of see the ways in which they're still living out those lives of gathering and service. But not signing up as members for a parish community. So I think that it is happening. I think that what I encourage us as Anglicans to do is to be really clear about the things that we're really good at. I think that we're really, really good at being a church that makes room for people to think for themselves. I think that we create space that is non-judgmental. I think that we create space where questions are welcomed and where we don't mind getting into some of the thornier conversations, where we don't mind, exploring the gray areas and not just having black and white answers. I think that those are markers of the kind of community that we as Anglicans can be good at creating. In my book, I talk a lot about the STEP Center, which we created at our church as a response to the young people that we were seeing in downtown St. Catharines who were just struggling so much with mental illness and with obvious patterns of family dysfunction that went back several generations. People who just seemed so alone at such a young age. And we were really careful in the STEP Center that this was not a bait and switch. Like, this was not, we will provide you with free counseling, but then we're going to tell you about Jesus. This is free counseling, full stop. A resource center for young people on the margins in our city, full stop. I think we're really good as Anglicans about being clear that we're not doing a bait and switch. I went to Pikangikum this past summer, and again, Pikangikum comes up throughout the book in terms of Indigenous water partnerships that we've been developing in the Anglican Church of Canada. And we had supper in the home of a wonderful, faithful woman named Colleen, who is a missionary in Pikangikum and has been there for the past, I think, 20 years, serving the people of Pikangikum. But she said something really interesting to us. She said, it's just amazing how, like, your denomination would just be concerned about water. Like, our denomination, the one that sponsors her being there, they're concerned about saving people's souls, which is great. But she's like, it's so wonderful that, like, you just want people to be able to drink clean water, and that's the investment. And again, it's not we're going to partner with you on clean water, but then we want you to sign on the dotted line about believing the same things that we do. As Anglicans, we're really good at those corporal acts of mercy that don't have to then lead to, people being part of our Christian faith in exactly the way that we would like them to. So I would just say that those are kind of a few things off the top of my head that I think that we want to nurture and encourage wherever we are, wherever we're gathering with people. How do we create those safe places to have conversations that are nuanced and that don't have all of the answers and that invite people to wrestle and to think for themselves? And how do we equip people for faithful and courageous lives of service? And how do we just really embody the mercy and justice of God? And those things are happening. We need to attend to them and celebrate them. Other people going to make their way to the microphone here? I feel like everybody was quite chatty over lunch and in their conversations. What's going on?
So one of the things that we talked about was this, when you mentioned the idea of how the metrics of how we measure success and failure. And so that's the kind of thing I've experienced, and we talked about that in our group, about not wanting to be the one on parish council or in a decision-making capacity if the church has to close. So this sense of, I don't want this all to collapse while I'm in leadership. So again, there's that we've invested so much in success looks like this. It looks like more people. It looks like more offerings. It looks like sustainability well into the future. And anything other than that is failure. So, and I was worried that our metrics are based on the baby boom, which isn't coming back, as far as I can tell. And the demographics would suggest family size has decreased substantially since certainly the 30s, the 50s, and families are having fewer children. Like there was all kinds of things that, again, the stuff we can't control. But how do we realign to what it means maybe not to be successful, but to be faithful to where God is calling us? How do we get away from that fear of failure? So I think that was something that came up in our group.
Yeah, I think that, I appreciate your naming all of those dynamics because they're real and they weigh heavily on us in leadership, not just, again, as ordained leaders in the church, but I think all of us who really care about the church going forward. And I think the big piece of advice that I would offer, because I've seen how it can kind of change that dynamic, is we need to broaden the conversation so that it's not a conversation that rests on individual people or individual parishes. We went through a really faithful, hard, courageous discernment in St. Catherine's. We had 11 Anglican parishes in a city of, 120,000 people. And we met for 2 years. Those 11 parishes, representatives from each of the parishes, each of the clergy from those 11 parishes for 2 years. At the end of that time, we had done a real audit of resources, of what we had and what we wanted. Again, that we can't do everything. We can do anything, but we can't do everything. At the end of those 2 years, there were 3 churches that decided to leave their buildings. All of those people kind of made that decision in the sense of a wider community and the sense of what they were moving toward. So I think it was kind of the 3 most successful and hope-filled church closures that our diocese had ever seen. All of the people who had been attending those congregations found new church homes and invested in those new church homes. And all of the churches experienced quite a bit of just renewed possibility of how we could invest both in formation, Christian learning, Christian discipleship, and also in Christian service. And there's been some really interesting initiatives in St. Catherine's as a result around feeding programs and justice programs, but also renewal of our Christian lives. So, I think it can feel really lonely and really burdensome having those conversations by ourselves. But that's another benefit that we have in this particular denomination, and the way that our denomination is set up is that we actually, don't have to just flounder alone. We can talk collectively about who we are and what we want to do. I think the longer we can give those conversations to happen, the more hope-filled they become. All right, I don't want to shut down conversation, but any more takers? Anybody else want to come up to the microphone? Okay, well, I have just so enjoyed being with you today. I've so enjoyed being here in Charlottetown for the past couple of days. My son Gordon has also really enjoyed the time that we've been able to share here on the island. Thank you so much for having me and having us. Thank you for your faithful and brave conversations and willingness to engage in these faithful and brave conversations. I'm going to just put up that slide one more time about the books. You can still grab a book. They do all have study questions at the end of each chapter, so it's a really good book in terms of engaging this conversation in your local communities and inviting people to get real about where we are, but also to feel hopeful about where we're going. So thank you so much, and it's been a true delight to be with you.